Harlem, 1956. The alley smelled of damp brick and old smoke, the kind that clung to coats long after the night ended. A single street lamp flickered, barely holding back the dark. The white detective stood beneath it, jacket torn, badge exposed, his revolver hanging uselessly at his side. He had stopped resisting. Men ringed him in silence, faces half-lit, waiting for permission rather than blood. He knew the rules. In this part of Harlem, a white cop didn't get surrounded unless a decision had already been made. His breath slowed, not from calm, but from understanding. This was the moment men talked about later. This was where names ended. Then the crowd shifted. Bumpy Johnson stepped forward, coat buttoned, hat low, hands relaxed at his sides. No rush. No anger. His eyes moved once around the alley, measuring everyone present. The noise of the city seemed to recede, as if Harlem itself leaned closer to listen. Someone expected a signal, a nod, a word. It never came. Bumpy looked at the detective, really looked at him, as if deciding whether he existed at all. The cop met his gaze and saw nothing familiar there. No hatred, no mercy. Only calculation, only patience, the kind that outlives violence. A murmur passed through the men. Confusion followed it. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Debts were paid with pain. Warnings were written in blood. Everyone in that alley had learned that lesson young, either by watching or by surviving it. Bumpy raised a single hand. The motion was small, almost dismissive, as if he were brushing dust from a table. It was not a gesture of kindness. It was a signal of ownership. Let him go. 2 words. No explanation. No ceremony. The order cut through the night sharper than a gunshot. The circle loosened. A path opened where there hadn't been one seconds earlier. The detective didn't move at first, unsure if this was another kind of test. Bumpy didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. The cop walked. Each step felt borrowed. No one touched him. No one followed. Behind him, the alley closed again, swallowing the moment whole, sealing it away from witnesses and from easy stories. Every man there felt it, though none could name it, the sense that something permanent had shifted, and that the rules they lived by had just been rewritten, without warning or witnesses. What no one in that alley understood, neither the men who stayed nor the cop who escaped, was that this decision was not mercy. It was leverage. And from that night forward, Harlem would move to a quieter, colder order, shaped by a silence that would protect it for 20 years. If you want more untold stories like this, stories power tried to erase, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Before that alley, before the silence and the decision that confused everyone who witnessed it, there was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, a man most people reduced to a nickname because it was easier than understanding him. Bumpy Johnson was not feared because he was loud. He was feared because he rarely needed to be. In a world where men proved themselves through noise, through sudden violence and public rage, Bumpy built his reputation on something slower and far more unsettling: patience. He listened longer than others. He remembered details others discarded. And when he acted, it was never for the moment. It was for the years that followed. Harlem respected him not because he terrorized it, but because he stabilized it. He understood that uncontrolled violence attracted attention, and attention invited intervention. Chaos, to Bumpy, was weakness pretending to be strength. Every reckless killing shortened a man's lifespan. Every emotional decision created enemies who would eventually find leverage of their own. Bumpy didn't survive Harlem by accident. He survived because he treated power like a long-term investment, not a thrill. When he spoke softly, people listened, because they knew volume had already failed. His words carried weight precisely because they were rare. He didn't waste language on threats. He didn't posture. Those who worked under him understood that silence was not absence, it was expectation. And expectations, unmet, had consequences that arrived quietly and stayed permanent. Bumpy's mind was always several moves ahead. Where others saw individuals, a rival, a cop, a traitor, he saw systems. Police departments, political machines, public perception. He knew that institutions remembered patterns even when individuals disappeared. Revenge satisfied pride. Leverage shaped outcomes. And Bumpy was far more interested in outcomes than satisfaction. That distinction defined him. He did not act from impulse. He measured decisions the way a chess player measures endgames, asking not who suffers now, but who controls the board later. Mercy and cruelty were tools to him, not emotions. He used each only when it produced stability. Anything else was indulgence. This is why Harlem listened. Not because Bumpy promised protection through fear, but because he delivered predictability in an unpredictable world. Streets stayed quieter when he was respected. Businesses survived when he was obeyed. Children slept better when chaos was kept at bay by rules no one dared break. He was not a hero. He was something far more effective, a regulator. Understanding this matters, because without it, that alley in 1956 makes no sense. Sparing a white cop would look like weakness to men who believe power had to announce itself. It would look like sentiment to those who mistook restraint for hesitation. But Bumpy was never sentimental. Kindness did not guide him. Calculation did. He understood something few others did at the time, that the right man spared could do more work alive than dead. That silence could bind tighter than threats. That a life spared under the right conditions could become an asset no one else could see coming. As the men in the alley waited for a signal, they didn't see any of this. They saw only the present. Bumpy saw the next 20 years. And as the white cop stood there, breath shallow, weapon lowered, waiting for judgment, he had no idea that he wasn't being weighed as a man, but as a future. Harlem in the 1950s lived under pressure that never made the papers. It wasn't just crime. It was surveillance, resentment, and a constant reminder of who held legal authority and who merely occupied space. White cops patrolled black neighborhoods like foreign territory, enforcing laws unevenly, sometimes inventing them on the spot. A single arrest could turn into a public lesson. A single accusation could shut down an entire block. Inside the NYPD, corruption moved quietly and efficiently. Payoffs changed hands. Promotions followed loyalty, not merit. Informants were cultivated and discarded. When one stopped being useful, he disappeared, transferred, silenced, or found face down somewhere that didn't invite questions. Harlem noticed the pattern even when no one explained it. What the department couldn't control, it punished collectively. Raids increased after isolated incidents. Businesses were harassed to send messages upward. Neighborhoods were treated as suspects rather than communities. It created an environment where fear spread faster than crime itself, and where survival depended on understanding which rules were real and which were performances. The detective in that alley was a product of this system, and an exception to it. He wasn't loved by his department. He didn't drink with the right people. He didn't collect when others did. He filed reports that made superiors uncomfortable and asked questions that stalled careers. To some cops, he was unreliable. To others, he was dangerous in a different way, not corrupt enough to control, not clean enough to trust. Harlem knew his name long before that night. They feared him because he was thorough. He remembered faces. He came back to streets others forgot. But they also watched him closely, because unlike most, he didn't escalate for spectacle. He enforced selectively. He let certain things pass. He learned the rhythms of the neighborhood instead of trying to crush them. That made him suspicious on all sides. Bumpy understood this tension immediately. By the mid-1950s, pressure was tightening around him from multiple directions. Italian mobs wanted territory. Younger crews wanted a seat. Police commanders wanted a headline. Informants were being flipped aggressively, sometimes sloppily. The balance Bumpy had maintained through restraint was being tested by men who believed disruption was opportunity. In that climate, the cop's presence in the alley wasn't accidental. It was collision. Killing him would send a message, one Harlem had sent before. It would satisfy rivals who wanted chaos to force change. It would reassure hotheads who mistook blood for authority. But it would also invite retaliation, investigations, federal attention, the kind of scrutiny that didn't fade. Sparing him, on the other hand, offered no immediate reward. It would confuse allies. It would anger enemies. It would look like hesitation in a world that punished it quickly. No one there could see what Bumpy saw, because what Bumpy saw required time to matter. The alley grew quieter as the moment stretched. Men shifted their weight. No one spoke. Everyone waited. The city seemed to hold its breath with them. And as the silence thickened, the decision drew close, not as a moral question, but as a strategic one, where the wrong answer would echo for years. Because stories like this don't get told twice, make sure you're subscribed. The alley did not explode into motion after Bumpy's order. It tightened. Men who had been ready for violence now had to sit with restraint, and restraint is harder to carry than rage. No one spoke. No one challenged him. That silence was the first test, and everyone failed it except Bumpy. He did not explain himself. He did not soften the moment with reason or warning. Explanation creates negotiation, and negotiation weakens authority. By saying nothing, Bumpy made the decision final. There would be no debate later. No reinterpretation. What happened in that alley would stand exactly as it was, unanswered and therefore unquestionable. For the detective, survival arrived without relief. He understood immediately that walking away was not freedom. It was obligation. He had not been spared by chance or emotion. He had been spared intentionally, and intention always comes with expectation. No terms were spoken, but none were needed. A man like Bumpy did not give gifts. He placed weights. As the cop stepped forward, the distance between him and the circle felt heavier than the distance behind him. Each step carried awareness. He was being measured not for what he had done, but for what he might do next. Bumpy's eyes never followed him. They didn't need to. Attention would have suggested concern. Indifference was far more controlling. This was the true test, not whether Bumpy could order mercy, but whether everyone present would accept silence as command. Some wanted blood. Others wanted clarity. Neither received it. And in that uncertainty, loyalty was revealed. The men who stayed quiet proved they understood power. The ones who shifted or hesitated exposed themselves. Betrayal does not always announce itself through action. Sometimes it appears as delay, as doubt, as the question someone almost asks. Bumpy watched all of it without comment, storing reactions the way others stored grudges. He knew who needed watching now. He knew who had to be reminded later. The detective reached the mouth of the alley and stopped. For a moment, he considered turning back, saying something, acknowledging the debt forming behind him. He didn't. That hesitation was his mistake. Bumpy noticed. Silence, after all, cuts both ways. The cop continued on, heart steady but heavy, knowing the terms of his survival would reveal themselves over time. He would think twice before ordering a raid. He would redirect attention instead of escalating it. He would remember certain names and forget others. Not because he was told to, but because forgetting would now feel safer. Behind him, the alley remained still. No celebration. No discussion. The absence of reaction was deliberate. Bumpy understood that spectacle invites scrutiny, and scrutiny shortens influence. By allowing the moment to dissolve quietly, he ensured it would live longer in memory than any display of force. That night marked a division few could articulate. Violence would still exist. Threats would still circulate. But something subtler had taken root, an understanding that restraint could bind stronger than fear, that a life spared could become a hinge on which futures turned. The men who remained understood it too, though none would say it aloud. They had witnessed a recalibration of power, one that demanded patience instead of adrenaline. From that point forward, loyalty would be judged less by action and more by discipline. Talking too much would become dangerous. Acting too fast would become suspect. Bumpy had redrawn the boundaries. Some would resent him for it. Younger men, eager to prove themselves, would whisper that mercy made leaders soft. They would be wrong, and time would teach them so. Others would feel relief, recognizing that stability, even under quiet authority, was preferable to the constant churn of funerals and retaliation. Order, however informal, had returned. And Bumpy, standing where he had been moments before, absorbed every reaction. He catalogued faces, postures, silences. This was the cost of restraint, vigilance. By choosing not to spill blood, he had committed himself to watching carefully, correcting slowly, and punishing only when absolutely necessary. The detective, walking alone now, did not know any of this in detail, but he felt its shape. A pressure without hands. A rule without language. From that night on, Harlem was watching him. There. Time moved on, the way it always does, indifferent to moments that once felt permanent. Seasons changed. Faces aged. New names rose and fell. And yet, beneath the ordinary noise of Harlem life, something subtle had shifted. Something no one could quite point to, but everyone could feel. There was no public alliance. No whispered confirmation. No meetings in back rooms or favors exchanged in daylight. Bumpy Johnson never called the detective. Never sent word. Never reminded him of that alley or the debt formed there. Silence, once again, did the work. Police activity changed first, though it took time to notice. Raids still happened, but they no longer escalated without reason. Entire blocks stopped being punished for the actions of one man. Patrol cars passed certain streets more slowly, more thoughtfully. Some addresses were visited repeatedly. Others, conspicuously, were not. To outsiders, it looked like coincidence. To Harlem, it felt like calibration. Violence followed the adjustment. It did not disappear, but it narrowed. Reckless bloodshed declined. Conflicts ended sooner, quieter. Men who pushed too hard found pressure waiting for them from unexpected directions. Not arrests exactly, delays, denials, interruptions that stalled momentum until ambition cooled. Chaos lost its efficiency. Informants vanished, but not randomly. Those who talked carelessly were exposed quickly, isolated before they could cause damage. Others were left alone, quietly protected by irrelevance. The pattern was invisible unless you lived inside it. From the outside, nothing connected. From within, everything aligned. The detective enforced a different kind of law now. Not softer, but more selective. He learned which battles created stability and which only invited attention. He redirected manpower. He buried certain reports in paperwork. He followed procedure with a precision that gave him cover while granting Harlem space. His superiors noticed the results, but couldn't fault the methods. Crime statistics shifted just enough to justify restraint. Bumpy never interfered directly. That was crucial. Direct control would have created evidence, resentment, dependence. Instead, he allowed the system to believe it was acting on its own better judgment. That illusion protected everyone involved. The cop felt watched, but not managed. Guided, but never ordered. The absence of contact made the bond stronger, not weaker. Psychological dominance thrives in uncertainty. The detective never knew when restraint was expected and when it wasn't. That ambiguity forced caution. Every decision carried weight. Every action was filtered through the memory of a life spared without explanation. He became disciplined because discipline felt safer than assumption. Others noticed the change in him. Younger officers learned from his example without understanding its origin. They absorbed his patience, his refusal to escalate, his habit of leaving certain situations untouched. Over time, that posture spread, not as policy, but as culture. Harlem adjusted in response, responding to predictability with restraint of its own. Bumpy watched all of this from a distance. He didn't claim credit. He didn't need acknowledgement. Influence that announces itself invites challenge. Influence that operates quietly becomes permanent. By staying absent, he ensured the balance remained intact, self-sustaining, and deniable. Years passed this way. The city changed around them. Administrations turned over. New conflicts emerged. Yet the quiet order held longer than anyone expected. No documents tied it together. No witness could testify to it. There were only patterns, and patterns are easy to ignore when they benefit everyone. No one could prove anything. And that was the point. The truth never arrived as a headline. There was no investigation, no courtroom revelation, no moment where secrets were dragged into daylight. Instead, it surfaced the way real power always does, through patterns that only made sense once enough time had passed. Harlem endured while other neighborhoods fractured. As drugs intensified, as violence spiked across the city, certain streets remained intact longer than anyone expected. Businesses survived downturns that wiped out competitors elsewhere. Disputes ended before they spiraled. It wasn't peace, but it was continuity. And continuity in that era was rare enough to raise quiet questions. Younger cops noticed it first. They didn't know why, only that some areas resisted disorder in ways statistics couldn't explain. They learned which corners didn't reward aggression, which arrests stalled careers instead of advancing them, which reports were better left thin. No one instructed them. They absorbed the lesson by watching what happened to those who ignored it. Criminals learned faster. Loud men didn't last. Those who talked too much drew attention they couldn't survive. Silence became currency. Restraint became protection. A reputation for patience began to matter more than a reputation for fear. Harlem adapted, not because it was told to, but because adaptation kept people alive. Only in hindsight did the shape of it become visible. Only later did men begin to connect the years of quiet stability to a single moment no one had recorded. A choice made in an alley. A life spared without explanation. A system nudged, not forced, into a different posture. Bumpy Johnson's power was never loud enough to challenge openly, and that was precisely why it endured. He didn't dominate by presence. He influenced by absence. By refusing to leave fingerprints, he made retaliation impossible. You can't indict a pattern. You can't arrest silence. Those who tried to challenge him publicly found themselves isolated, unsupported, exposed. Not crushed immediately, but left alone long enough to fail on their own. That was the difference. Violence creates martyrs. Isolation creates lessons. By the time Bumpy's name became legend, much of what he had shaped was already accepted as normal. The streets operated a certain way. The police behaved a certain way. And no one alive could fully explain why, only that it worked better than what had come before. That is the final deception of real authority. It doesn't demand recognition. It doesn't need applause. It embeds itself so deeply into routine that people mistake it for order rather than influence. Power doesn't announce itself. Real authority leaves no fingerprints. And by the time the reckoning arrives, there is nothing left to expose, only outcomes that speak for themselves. If stories about legacy, power, and untold history matter to you, like, share, and subscribe. These aren't just stories. They're lessons. Years later, the white detective retired quietly. He left Harlem without ceremony, without recognition. Few noticed his absence. Fewer understood the subtle authority he had exercised under Bumpy's unseen guidance. His career had been defined less by arrests than by the invisible boundaries he maintained. Boundaries that preserved lives and stabilized streets in ways statistics could never measure. Harlem remembered, though not through written records or newspaper accounts. The stories passed in whispers, in nods on stoops, in the careful way merchants locked their doors or left them open at night. Bumpy Johnson's name circulated with reverence that went beyond fear. The legend was not built on the threat of bullets, but on the quiet assurance that someone had already thought 10 moves ahead, that every action carried consequence, whether it was seen or not. Fear evolved into respect, and respect into acknowledgement that survival depended on understanding the rules no one spoke aloud. The lessons were clear. True power does not announce itself. It is exercised with certainty, not noise. Mercy, when wielded deliberately, can be more controlling than violence. Silence, when sustained, can govern longer than force. Bumpy had demonstrated this principle not through spectacles of blood, but through invisible calibrations that shaped an entire neighborhood's behavior over decades. The moral is subtle, almost imperceptible. Authority that leaves no fingerprints lasts longest. Decisions made in the quiet, with patience and calculation, echo further than the loudest gunshot. The alley in 1956 was a single moment, but its ramifications extended for generations. Unseen, yet undeniable. And in the end, the truth of power is distilled into one enduring fact. The most dangerous man in Harlem wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. It was the one who decided when no one else would.